All right, so hello everybody. As Josie just kindly introduced me, my name is Tayah, and today I'm going to be talking to you about an interesting topic that blends my past excitement for ancient life with my current scientific knowledge, including the topic of de-extinction or the recreation of extinct animals. But first, I'm going to talk to you guys about kind of my path to science. So I'm originally from Ohio, where I went to college and graduated with a chemical engineering degree. You can see me there with my college mascot. It's a penguin. And then I moved to Connecticut, where I'm now a chemistry student in the Crawford Lab at Yale. So although my research topic in the lab is actually working on colorectal cancer and different prevention methods for cancer, I'm going to be talking to you today about something completely different. So ever since I was a little girl, I have loved dinosaurs and ancient life. As you can see, there's even a professional picture of me there holding a dinosaur. I'm sure my parents didn't appreciate that, but yeah, when I was in kindergarten, I didn't tell people I wanted to be, a firefighter or a princess, but I would tell everyone and even sounded out that I wanted to be a paleontologist. And so although life leads us in many different directions, I have been able to kind of maintain my passion for dinosaurs and ancient life and also gain a deeper, kind of understanding of them with the current scientific knowledge that I have. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. And you guys might recognize that Triceratops there from outside the Peabody. So let's get into it. So one of the first things that you may think of when you hear dinosaurs is Jurassic Park. Maybe not this Jurassic Park that me and my sister are taking a picture at, but in general, the movies and different ideas that have stemmed from this idea. So in case you guys don't know about the Jurassic Park movies, there are a set of islands in the middle of the ocean where scientists are able to bring dinosaurs back to life. And then they create a zoo or amusement park full of these extinct creatures that people can then visit. So as you can tell from the success of the Jurassic Park franchise, many people are fascinated by ancient and extinct species, not just me, and hopefully you guys are excited too, or else you might be a little sad during this presentation today. But not only is this excitement kind of seen in the movies, but think about the last time you guys went to a natural history museum. Or what about, the Peabody Museum back before it was closed for construction? It's really common for these places to open up to awe-inspiring displays of, big skeletons or even realistic models of these ancient animals. For example, you can see, this nice dinosaur in the lobby of the American Museum of Natural History. Or think back to the last time you were at the Peabody, the large brontosaurus that's in that first room there right when you walk in. And so when you go to these places or watch these movies, it's fun to kind of imagine what it would be like to live amongst dinosaurs, mammoths, and dodo birds. But while imagining this, your mind may wander back to Jurassic Park a little bit. So these movies aren't only exciting because of the amazing creatures that they bring back to life, but they're more interesting because of all the problems that occur. So if you can think of any problems that occur in these movies, feel free to drop in the chat. There's a ton. There's been a lot of movies, so feel free to drop those in the chat. But just some of them I've listed here, including escaping animals, malfunctioning technology like their cages, people making decisions based on power or money. But however, one of the biggest problems I think that Jurassic Park faced were kind of their lack of thinking and critical problem solving skills before they even brought these animals back to life. And so I'm going to spend the rest of the time, as Josie mentioned, talking about the closest that we've come to a real Jurassic Park. But I encourage you, and this is going to be important for your breakout session later, to think critically about my presentation and come up with some important questions that you think the public or scientists should address before this ever happens. But let's get into the real meat of this. So in Jurassic Park, dinosaurs are brought back to life when they discover a mosquito trapped in amber, and in the mosquito's abdomen, there's still blood, and they take dinosaur DNA from the blood. So while mosquitoes have actually been found to have blood still in their abdomen, ancient mosquitoes, there's no dinosaur DNA that remains in there because DNA in blood degrades over time. And as a reminder, DNA contains the genetic information responsible for the development and function of an organism. And while your DNA could easily be obtained from your hair or your saliva or your nails, ancient DNA can be a lot harder to study because it's only present in very small amounts. It's normally fragmented due to age, and it's often contaminated with bacteria and fungal DNA that wasn't around during the time those samples originally got there. So rather than looking like this, ancient DNA looks a little bit something more like this. So it's a little bit harder to work with. However, with all these problems, there is one condition that seems to be most ideal for DNA preservation. So does anybody know what this is? Feel free to put it in the chat if you know what this is. Well, in case you don't know, this is permafrost, which is a thick subsurface layer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year. So even in the summertime, this ground soil layer is still frozen. And permafrost can most commonly be found in Siberia, Canada, and Greenland. So permafrost is really good for preserving ancient DNA because it limits the amount of contamination that's observed, because keeping it frozen all the time, no bacteria can sneak in there, and it just keeps it really well preserved. And this is good especially for hair. And actually, fun fact, just this last February, the oldest sample of DNA ever found was found in a permafrost sample dating back to 1.2 million years ago. So we're still making a ton of discoveries in permafrost, even just a few months ago. But knowing that DNA is best preserved in hair, and maybe hinting back to the intro slide that I was on, can anybody think of a better Jurassic Park candidate than the dinosaurs that they use in the movies? Feel free to put it in the chat. I'd say woolly mammoths based on this information. So woolly mammoths DNA preservation in their hair and in permafrost, plus a few other factors, including their relative recent extinction timeframe, have allowed scientists to make a ton of exciting discoveries. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my talk with you guys today talking about woolly mammoths and the discoveries that have been made so far. So woolly mammoths are related to today's elephants, as you could probably guess, by looking at them, even in the movies. And specifically, their closest living relative is the Asian elephant. So just a few facts about woolly mammoths before we jump into the science. Woolly mammoths were covered in thick brown fur, and they had large curved tusks, which we believe may have been used for fighting or for a digging tool for foraging. They were around with a lot of snow, so they used their tusks to kind of dig in there and get food. Mammoths were around 13 feet tall, weighed around 6 tons, and some of their hair even reached up to 3 feet long. While you may think of mammoths, only being in the Arctic, mammoths actually lived in this whole yellow region on the map. So, even in Connecticut, they were stomping around. But it's pretty cool to see all the places that mammoths were back in the day. And although I've been talking a lot about Jurassic Park during this talk, you guys hopefully know that mammoths were not around during the Jurassic period, but rather they were around during the Pleistocene era, with most mammoths dying out roughly 10,000 years ago. So not that long compared to the trivia fact that you guys had at the intro of this talk, way more recently than dinosaurs. However, although I just said that most mammoths died out 10,000 years ago, there was actually a very small population of woolly mammoths that became isolated on this island called Rangel Island between Russia and Alaska, shown right there on the map. And this happened when temperatures increased and the water levels started to rise coming out of the ice age. And so these mammoths, a population of about 300, were stranded on this island, and they actually lived until roughly 4,000 years ago. So they lived 6,000 years past all the mainland mammoths. But because of their really small population size and the drastically different island environment that they were on, these mammoths had a lot of DNA differences compared to the other mammoths. So scientists have really enjoyed kind of seeing all these differences as well. So into the science. So while you may imagine discovering a mammoth to look something like this out of permafrost, they look a little bit different than this. And lucky for you guys, in the last 15 years, 2 of the best preserved mammoth remains have been discovered. So I'm about to show you them, so brace yourself. These are them. Not the prettiest things to look at, but still really cool. Definitely different than dinosaur bones. So on the right here is Lubia, and she is a 42,000-year-old mammoth calf, and she was discovered in pristine condition in 2007. But then 5 years later, in 2012, Yucca, a juvenile mammoth, so a little bit older than Lubia, came in and challenged Lubia as the best preserved mammoth samples ever found. And so from samples taken from Lubia and Yucca and other well-preserved mammoths, scientists have been able to use sequencing to discover a lot of genomic differences between mammoths and elephants. And just for you guys' information, if you want to see Lubia and Yucca now, you're going to have to go all the way to Russia. But these mammoths in the past have done world tours where they stop at different museums. So keep your fingers crossed that they eventually, come to the United States so we can go see them. Or maybe they'll find another one soon that we can see. But as I said, a lot of the discoveries that scientists have made have been through the investigation of mammoth DNA. And so I've been told that you guys actually, in your previous Exploring Science talks, have talked about DNA sequencing. So I'm not going to get super into it. But here is a figure just kind of reminding you guys generally how it works. But scientists can use sequencing information from the mammoth DNA that they take from permafrost samples. And then they can determine which stretches of the DNA contain genes. And you guys know genes like what makes your eyes the certain color. But once researchers have the sequence of mammoth DNA, they compare it to elephant DNA and they look for differences. And then they go through each one of these differences and try to figure out what the differences actually meant for the mammoth. So next, I'm going to highlight a few discoveries that they have found through this method. So incredible sequencing advancements have allowed scientists to sequence multiple mammoth genomes. And you guys might be aware that the genome is the collection of all the DNA that makes up an organism. So mammoth genomes consist of about 4 billion bases, while you guys, us humans, have roughly 3 billion bases. As I told you at the beginning of the talk, the closest relative to the mammoth is the Asian elephant, and this was actually confirmed through sequencing comparison. So Asian elephants, they've determined share 99.96% of their DNA with woolly mammoths, which may seem like a lot, that's pretty high percent, but lucky for scientists, that means that there's still 1.4 million differences left to research. So don't worry, there's going to be plenty of more research. If you guys are interested in this, there's plenty of time, which is exciting for me because I will stay up to date on this. But so far, a lot of these differences that scientists have been looking at are linked to mammoths' cold adaptations. So this has included genes relating to small ears and tail to minimize heat loss, thick fur, large fat layers, and insulation-focused glands to help survive in freezing environments. So obviously, you're like, yeah, Tayah, I could have figured that out on my own by looking at woolly mammoths. I could have pointed out all of those to you. But don't worry, there are also more kind of hidden cold adaptations in the DNA sequence. So some of those more hidden ones that you couldn't see just by looking at a woolly mammoth include at least 8 genes linked to mammoth circadian clocks. And circadian clock is like your natural body clock, when your body tells you when you should be awake and when you should be asleep. So mammoths, they survived in periods of the winter just being complete darkness the whole time, and then in the summer having constant sunlight. So their circadian clock is much different than elephants nowadays, who have normal, night and day time periods. They also have found genes that are different between mammoths and elephants, related to cold sensor alterations, meaning that mammoths probably were less sensitive to cold temperatures. Genomic studies have not only provided information on mammoth cold adaptations, but also on their behaviors and social structure. So scientists can use mammoth DNA to discover if mammoth samples are coming from a male or a female mammoth. And scientists have found that male samples are way more common in the fossil record than female samples, about 70 to 30. So I'll tell you why they think this is. So because fossil records have shown that mammoths lived in sex-segregated herds led by a female, researchers think that male mammoths left their herds at a young age where they were more vulnerable to fall in, mud traps or sinkholes, which then perfectly kind of went into permafrost. So those were the best conditions for permafrost to form. So they think that those male mammoths were more vulnerable, leading to their more samples being preserved in permafrost. Further, their DNA shows about mammoths' diet, which is pretty cool. They have noticed that mammoths had a very high nitrogen diet. For example, they think that mammoths may have consumed plants that had higher nitrogen values, including herbs, and not as much like woody vegetation. And they think this, which is a little funny, but also makes sense. They think that these mammoth herds lived in small locational ranges, that they often walked the same route throughout the year. And so they walked the route depositing feces, and then the next time they came around, they were able to eat very, fertilized, nitrogen-rich plants. So look what we can learn from DNA. But I did not come here just to tell you about mammoth discoveries. I started today hinting at Jurassic Park. So although these discoveries are super exciting, and I mentioned there's still 1.4 million differences to research, researchers are very excited about going further. They want to create a living woolly mammoth. So can anybody think of a famous example of something like this, bringing an animal to life? Put it in the chat if you can think of it. Maybe like cloning. I don't know if you guys have learned about, one of the most recognized cloned animals. I'll give it a second. If you guys guessed it, it's Dolly the sheep. So Dolly the sheep was the first largely recognized cloned animal. And she was cloned in 1996. And so if you haven't heard about Dolly before, I'll just quickly tell you about her. This sheep was the first proof that cells could be used to create an exact copy of an animal that they came from. And so Dolly was like the first, largest recognized clone animal that we were able to do. And so obviously, the minute that this happened, scientists jumped at the idea of creating a mammoth. And actually, this idea of cloning or creating a mammoth was theorized as early as 1950s, so like 70 years ago. However, our technology is just now getting to the point where we can scratch the surface on this. And so since the cloning of Dolly, there have been some labs completely devoted to bringing mammoths back to life. So my lab studies, colorectal cancer, and then there are other labs completely studying woolly mammoth revival. So the idea of bringing a mammoth back to life is something called de-extinction. So I had that on my first slide, but now I will get into telling you guys what it actually is. So de-extinction is defined as the recreation of an extinct species or an extinct species resemblant. Mammoths are a great candidate for de-extinction due to many reasons I told you about today, but the biggest of which are their relative recent extinction timeframe, 10,000 years ago roughly, their close living relative, which is the Asian elephant, and their ideal preservation methods for maintaining DNA in permafrost. And so while the process of de-extinction could possibly happen in a few different ways, there are different ideas here. The most promising method right now with the technology we have is through genome engineering. And that's shown in this figure here, roughly how we would do it. And so what you would do is you'd take mammoth DNA that's taken from the permafrost. And I'd already described you guys that ancient DNA is often fragmented and broken up. And so scientists would replace those missing pieces and fragments with Asian elephant DNA. And from there, the DNA would be inserted into an elephant egg, develop into an embryo, and then it would be delivered by a surrogate elephant. So of course, you're probably wondering logically, is this possible? Which that is always the question in science. So while I mentioned there are currently full-time research groups focused on this, and what they're doing is analyzing every single one of those 1.4 million differences between mammoth and elephant DNA, and they're individually mapping each difference into an elephant cell line. So they're taking the normal elephant cell line and making all of these differences to kind of transform it close enough to the mammoth DNA. And in 2019, actually, a research group made the biggest leap towards de-extinction so far, which is what I promised I would tell you about today. So this is a short 2-minute video that summarizes the findings of the paper. And so I'm just giving a forewarning, there is a lot of jargon toward the end of this video, even for me to understand. So don't worry if you get a little lost. But they do talk a lot about the topics I've mentioned today. So do your best to, try to understand, but this is some exciting stuff, and I'll summarize it at the end of the video.
An international team of biologists has done the seemingly impossible. They've revived cell nuclei from a 28,000-year-old frozen woolly mammoth. While the world will have to wait for the first full-blown mammoth resurrection, this could be a big step in that direction. The team's findings offer researchers hope that ancient DNA, though damaged, could one day be made functional. The research team salvaged the nuclei from the muscle of Yucca, a young woolly mammoth well preserved in Siberian permafrost since the last ice age. They then transplanted them into mouse egg cells. This process, called somatic cell nuclear transfer, is the same one used to clone animals like Dolly the sheep. But unlike for Dolly, the development of those nuclei stopped short of cell division. After the transfer, researchers observed filling of the transplanted nuclei with mouse proteins, namely histone and tubulin, and the formation of a new nucleus-like structure. That structure drove the formation of the characteristic spindles that pull genetic material apart during cell division. In the end, the pseudonucleus was absorbed by the nucleus of the mouse egg cell. While the mammoth DNA proved too damaged to follow through with cell division, data indicated that the natural DNA repair machinery of the mouse egg cell lent a helping hand. It tried to reverse at least some of the bruising Yucca's genetic material sustained while frozen for thousands of years, and that could be the biggest upshot of the team's work. Although reviving ancient creatures remains elusive, they've demonstrated for the first time that fossilized DNA can be at least partially reawakened.
So pretty exciting stuff. I know a little confusing with all the figures, even for me, so don't worry. But pretty much the summary is that these researchers were able to show that 28,000-year-old mammoth cell nuclei, which is where the genome is located, retained functional nucleus-like structures and unprecedented biological activity. So the cells did have biological activity, even though they were preserved for, thousands and thousands of years. And so this is, officially the closest that we've come to de-extinction. So obviously you guys are aware that we're still very far away, but the fact that we're even able to see any activity in these cells is actually incredible. And so we still have a ton to learn, but as you know, our technology keeps advancing and keeps getting better and better, there are so many more discoveries that are, you know, upon the horizon. So although all of this is exciting, it comes with a lot of questions, which I hinted at the beginning of my presentation. So my question for you leading into your breakout session is, if we bring a mammoth back to life, what considerations would we need to think about to do this properly? So think about things like ownership, care restrictions, Jurassic Park concerns, although I don't think we need to worry about woolly mammoths taking anyone out, but they could. And just think of how you would adjust your Jurassic Park based on what you heard today or anything cool that you heard during the presentation. And so now you guys are going to be split into your breakout rooms to discuss these ideas, and I'll have the volunteers tell me about it when we return. All right, so I guess just to hear what you guys talked about in your breakout rooms. Again, the question was kind of a what would you do question. So if the volunteers want to unmute themselves, you know, take turns and just say kind of the main points that were discussed. I'd love to hear what you guys talked about.
So in our room, we talked about, it was me and Bimig as the volunteers, and we had a lot of discussion on probably they wouldn't survive because they don't know, they don't have their same predators and things like that. And two, we had a lot of questions on why would we ever want to do this? Why would we want to resurrect or, you know, de-extinct woolly mammoths? And then there was also a lot of ideas circulating on how maybe it wouldn't be a good idea because this technology could be exploited to do bad things. Yeah, I think those were the main points.
I guess I'll comment on some of those points before the next person talks, but those are all really great discussion points. So good job to that group. One of the points there is definitely a big question of, would a mammoth, you know, be released into the wild, or would it be kept in captivity forever? So like if it was kept in captivity, you know, maybe we could make its care conditions a little bit closer to when they were around. I did see in the chat when I was just quickly browsing, a lot of you guys are like, why would you ever do this? And I think there's, you know, two sides to it. One, you know, science is constantly trying to push the boundaries of what we're capable of doing. You know, why do we go to the moon? So, you know, there's like that side of it. But then on the very realistic side, which I don't feel like is as powerful, is we've actually think about areas where animals go extinct from a certain area, which then causes a change in population of other creatures that are there. And so often they'll take that species and put them back to where they used to be. And then they, you know, manage the food chain and whatnot. And so there are some people who think that, you know, just plopping some mammoths in Siberia could actually help with the vegetation and food chain there. Obviously, that's a little bit of a stretch, but that is what the realistic people say that could benefit. So those are my two comments there. Does any other volunteers want to chip in what they talked about?
We had a really interesting idea in our breakout room of trying to create a habitat in a like specific protected area. So maybe not in captivity, but out in the wild in a protected area.
I like that idea. I like that suggestion. Yeah, it kind of makes me feel guilty when I do all this research and read about it. And I'm like, oh, it would be horrible if they just, you know, live their life in a cage. But in an area, you know, close to their old environment, but like could be monitored and not like super disruptive. I think that's a really nice idea. Thanks.
In our breakout room, we also talked a lot about the ethics of such a decision. And so, the ethics, of course, with the location, but also with how it would mix with current species that are currently living. We talked a lot about elephants and mammoths, and if they could maybe even cross, and what the ethics in that would be, creating a new species from an extinct species and a current species. And so that was definitely a big discussion in our group.
Yeah, just to touch on that, I guess going a little bit more into the science nerdiness of it. What they think, if this ever happens, is that a mammoth will never be 100% mammoth based on, the DNA samples that we can get from permafrost. And so it will always have a little bit of elephant in it. So technically, if we ever brought a mammoth back to life, it would be like a mammoth elephant hybrid, which then brings apart a lot more discussion about patents. So just a fun fact here, they tried to patent Dolly the Sheep and they said no, because Dolly the Sheep already existed because it's an exact clone. But if you clone a mammoth, which isn't really a mammoth, it gets a little bit more questionable. So I think those are really good points to discuss. So nice job to that group as well. I don't know how many groups there were, so I'll just wait until it's awkwardly quiet. But if anyone else has any points, feel free.
I think some students from my group were really good in identifying some potential habitats for woolly mammoths if they were brought back, like Siberia, I think was kind of voiced as one potential habitat. And then another student brought up the fact that even if woolly mammoths were brought back, you would have to be careful again, I think, as some students and I think Deandra's group brought up, that they didn't become invasive species and maybe push other native species to extinction. It would be really sad if you brought back one species at the cost of one or several others.
Yeah, and I think that I think we should just put this whole group in charge of picking the habitat from the mammoth that comes back. But yeah, it brings up a good question about conservation. So if we can bring a mammoth back, then why would we put all this effort into conserving other species that are endangered? If the public's just like, don't worry, we can bring it back in a few years. So there's questions there too of where to really put our focus. So good points there.
Yeah, our group had a lot of the points that were already mentioned, such as why you would want to do this and what kind of habitat would they live in. So members of the group brought up some interesting points about diseases and how woolly mammoths would respond to diseases that we have now, which I think is an important point as well.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And it's one of those questions that you wouldn't know until it happened. So that's definitely something for scientists to look into. Anybody else? Okay, that was an acceptable amount of silence time. Okay, and so these are my, I guess, biggest questions. So you guys did great hitting almost, all of these points. This is kind of where I've spent the majority of my thinking time. But you guys mentioned them too. How would mammoths react to the environment of today's time, as well as food availability? I mentioned that they eat really nitrogen-rich diets, which, the same things aren't around today. Would a mammoth be released in its natural habitat or live in captivity? Or, in your guys' case, a hybrid of both? Could a mammoth be patented, or would researchers purposely put enough, elephant DNA into it so that it could be patented? These are big questions. As I just mentioned, would de-extinction have any impact on current conservation efforts? And then the biggest question, which actually my group mentioned a little bit, of who controls the creation of life? Who really has that power to create something? And that's a question that, scientists kind of grapple with all the time. Not necessarily about mammoths, but this is the idea I've left you with today. And so I want to leave you guys just with some encouragement to dream big. So no idea is too crazy, obviously, based on the talk today. Science and exploration are really limitless. So keep working hard and striving to learn wherever you can. And although your life may lead you to all different paths, make you keep a hold of all your passions, even the ones that are a little crazy, like my love of dinosaurs. I'm happy to provide any additional information if you guys want to learn more about this. And thank you for listening. And I'll leave you with this, kind of fun mammoth quote that I found in one of my papers, which is, "There are many unknowns surrounding de-extinction. Whether it will happen or not, however, is likely not to be one of them." So thank you guys.
And thanks so much, Tayah. This was such a great talk. The students were very engaged throughout your presentation, and throughout the presentation, they actually dropped a lot of questions for you. So I'm going to ask a couple of those to you now.
Go for it. I wasn't able to see the chat at all times, so
yeah. First question I have for you today is, why does DNA degrade over time? So why is it fragmented and not complete?
Yeah, just like most things in life, they are not super stable forever. So I don't know, think about your human body. It gets older over time and, kind of goes away to bone after you pass away. It's the same thing with the genetic material that makes up all of you. It degrades over time as well.
I think that makes sense. We're not really immortal, so.
Yeah, everything goes away.
All right, another question we had was about the size of the genome. So does the genome size affect the complexity of the animal? I mean, you mentioned that theirs was a lot bigger than ours.
Yeah, so this is actually super interesting to look into. So obviously, if there's more bases, there's, more to look at. However, it doesn't correspond in any way to like the size of the animal. So like the fact that woolly mammoths have 4 billion and we have 3 billion, there's no difference there, because there are some, little frogs and things that have way bigger genomes than us. And so I would say it makes it more complex for scientists, but sometimes that genetic material is, not super exciting. So it just depends on the organism.
And speaking of the organism, we had a question in the chat about cloning humans. How close are scientists to cloning humans, and would that ever be possible?
While a lot of restrictions are in place for human cloning, I would say that generally the governments and countries are more behind on the regulations on genome engineering and cloning of like animals, especially to animals. Policies take a really long time to put into place, but I think the human cloning one was probably one that they were like, we should probably restrict that right away. I don't have the information to say how close we could be if we wanted to be, but I do think that's something that people probably would have a lot more hesitations about. But if you want to learn more about what we have cloned, there's a really nice Wikipedia page that lists all the animals we've cloned, and I encourage you to check it out because there's way more than I thought there were.
And last quick question, do you think you should bring back the woolly mammoths? What's your opinion?
Okay, I might be a little biased because I love science and I just gave you guys a 30-minute conversation about woolly mammoths. I think that there definitely needs to be a lot that's thought about before this ever happens. And I think we have plenty of time because I think that the science is still a little lacking. But I don't know, I think science really is about pushing limits and pushing boundaries. And I think if we did it with the right kind of mindset and the right restrictions in place, I think it'd be a really cool feat of science. And I think it would be something that scientists could be really proud of if it's done correctly.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Tayah, for such an amazing talk. And we are going to hear from one of our volunteers about what other science you have to hear about in the coming weeks.
Thank you, guys.